Our new topic will discuss various aspects of Asian American political life, and topics that we'll explore will intersect with the racialization of Asian Americans, certainly immigration, pan-ethnicity, citizenship, and national belonging, as well as contemporary political behavior and political participation. So, with our earlier historical exploration of Asian American immigration, we should now have a pretty solid historical backdrop to see how Asian Americans and their historical experiences connected. And indeed, you can't really dissociate it from Asian American politics. And even during the contemporary moment, how does the past experience or experiences of exclusion, political marginalization, discrimination, not to mention pretty severe actions taken against Asian Americans, such as internment and racialized citizenship, which we'll discuss. How do these collective experiences shape the political consciousness and the political behavior of Asian Americans today? So, first of all, there are some cornerstones that are going to be inescapable as we discuss this topics. First of all, the historical legacy, as I just mentioned, which is indissociably linked to exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination. But other things too that are more contemporary. Asian Americans, for example, are the fastest rising ethno-racial group in the United States today. As of 2025, they constitute about 7% of the U.S. population. And in fact, this growth in Asian American population is projected to reach 9% of the national population by 2050. So that is a very significant increase in just a decade and a half. Okay, so another inescapable category or topic is something we discussed in the past, but we will explore it in more depth in this discussion of Asian American politics. So, pan-ethnicity is the topic that refers to the process by which diverse ethnic groups are grouped together under a single and monolithic identity, such as Asian American. Okay, and why is this done? Well, we'll discuss this further, as I mentioned, but initially it was undertaken to gain political visibility, given the small number of Asian Americans in the country at that time, during the 1960s, when this first arose as an ethno-racial category. Okay, so it was created to gain political visibility, political influence, and to forge social solidarity. So obviously it's the case that with Asian Americans, you have such a diverse array of different ethnic groups originating from Asia, of course: Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, Indian, Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodian. We could include others like Taiwanese, Burmese, and what have you. And despite the enormous plurality and diversity, well, they're subsumed underneath a single label that we know as Asian American. So you can see how, in one sense, it was approached due to positive goals such as political visibility. Yet at the same time, one could argue that it has its disadvantages, pan-ethnicity, that is. Okay, so this is something, again, you cannot ignore, is the heterogeneity describing Asian Americans. But despite that, you could still generalize from uniform experiences that go back to number one, right? This legacy of exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination. And therefore, we could generalize from these, experiences had by Asian Americans and see how that translates into Asian American political outlooks and behaviors. So first, let's look into that category that we call Asian American. And of course, this is an official category used by the U.S. government, the state that is. And as I briefly alluded to just earlier, the term Asian American was not used until relatively recently. To be specific, the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. So prior to the 1960s, people of Asian descent in America were typically categorized and even identified by their specific nationality or their specific ethnicity, a specific racial group, like Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Korean, etc. And of course, they are all unofficially racialized, right, as Orientals, and even scientifically classified as quote unquote Mongolians, right? This was the science of race back then, which we briefly discussed in our topic of Salvador Rodin, right, and anti-miscegenation. But officially speaking, there was no lumping together of different Asians into a single category back then, okay? They tended to be separated accordingly, as I just described. So these groups often had little political solidarity because of that. They had very different migration histories, right? Chinese versus Japanese versus Filipinos, different class backgrounds, social class, certainly different languages, even different legal statuses once they arrived to the United States. Compared, for example, the ward, the Filipino migrant before 1946, known as the ward, compare that with aliens ineligible for citizenship, right? All right, so the corollary, if you will, to this is that Asian Americans had marginal political power that they could exercise in the public sphere, right, in the American political system, right? That's because they were fragmented into different groups, separate groups, and let's recall that there were very few Asians in the country at that time. So that prevented them from exercising more effective political power. Certainly, we're not claiming that they lack political power, lack political agency. In fact, we'll discuss cases of it. But compared to the dominant racial groups, right, or even other ethnic minorities, one could argue that they had less because of their smaller number, significantly smaller number. But by the 1960s again, during the age of civil rights, you see various social movements sweeping through the United States, civil rights, of course, but even anti-war against the Vietnam War. You see women's liberation, as they called it, something called Third World Liberation Movement, which we'll discuss in this topic of Asian American politics. And all of these this groundswell of social movements that try to reform society, reform race relations, reform gender, and what have you. It created a climate for new forms of political identity, and certainly that applied to Asian Americans. And again, I have to remind you, right, very small number, even in the 1960s. Okay, so the term Asian American was actually created and popularized by various Asian American intellectuals and activists and student leaders at that time, especially on the West Coast. Okay, of course, that's because Asian Americans were usually found in the West Coast, very few in the East Coast, let alone the Midwest. So why did this occur? Why did this category of Asian American, why was that created and, as I mentioned, popularized by these various Asian American scholars and student leaders and activists? Well, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, they wanted a shared political identity to address the racial discrimination and, of course, exclusion, underrepresentation in American society. And again, if they basically just stuck to their smaller categories like Chinese American, Japanese American, right? Well, it would not be as effective as if they united, right, as Asian Americans. So these earlier intellectuals and scholars felt that the term was needed for political solidarity. Okay, that is to say, to unite multiple Asian ethnic groups to fight racism and to advocate um, for their civil rights at that time, in the 60s, of course. So that's the background that led to that link with Asian Americans and pan-ethnicity. Again, the idea that people of different Asian backgrounds, that they shared a common social and economic and political challenges. Okay, and in other words, by forming a larger identity, a collective identity, right, a pan-ethnic identity, of course, Asian Americans could gain more visibility in politics, in education, in the media, certainly, and therefore it was felt to be a beneficial move, right? But by now, we're aware of what could be the problematic nature of this approach. That is, as we know, it sweeps aside the significant diversity, in fact, the enormous diversity, actually, right, within what you call Asian America, right? Diversity in terms of ethnicity, language, religion, class, migration paths and migration histories, and what have you. So it does have this usefulness, this utility in the context of equal rights, but there are also, if you will, downsides to this approach. Okay. In fact, let me quote a well-known social scientist, sociologist, Yenli Espiritu, who does pioneering work in Asian American history. She says, quote, "Pan-ethnicity is a political strategy that allows diverse groups to gain power and recognition, but it cannot erase the inequalities and differing priorities within these groups," unquote. Okay, so that sense right there exposes the fact that it is useful to gain power, but at the same time, you know, the pan-ethnic approach should not, or try not, to erase the inequalities within or among the groups. All right, so this label, as mentioned in the second line here, did not become official by the U.S. government or U.S. state until 1980. So in 1980, the U.S. Census officially adopts the term Asian American and Pacific Islander, as stated here in the slide. Now, one thing to notice here, we're talking about a specific institution, and that's the state, right? The government. The state is officially defining race. So this brings us to the concept of racial formation, okay, as stated here. Racial formation is a way to think about the social construction of race while bringing into the picture the various institutions and the social movements, right, like activists and intellectuals, like I just referred to, right, bringing them into this narrative of how social or of how race is socially constructed. So it involves the state, right, meaning the government. It involves members of that group in that racial formation, and it involves them contesting any external definition that's, foisted upon them, right? And what you see here is constant negotiation and contestation to arrive at a definition, which we'll discuss